When we talk about the Roman Empire, we conjure up images of grand triumphs, glittering forums, seasoned legionnaires whose discipline was unparalleled, and philosophers whose speeches have survived for millennia. It was a civilization that built roads, laws, cities, and, it would seem, eternity itself. Its legacy is still felt in our legal system, architecture, and language. But all this grandeur, all this power, all this dazzling brilliance stood on the shoulders of those who most often remain behind the scenes, who are not mentioned in solemn odes and are not depicted in majestic frescoes. On the shoulders of slaves. There were millions of them, so much so that in some periods Rome was literally a half-slave state. According to some estimates, in the 1st century BC in Italy, up to 35 to 40% of the population were slaves. These are not just numbers. This is a sea of human destinies, erased, absorbed by a huge machine. It wasn't just the captives of war who were captured by the hundreds of thousands after each successful campaign, or the children of captured provinces brought to the markets of Rome. They were also the children of the slaves themselves, born in captivity and doomed to the same fate from the first breath. They were everywhere. Among them were teachers who taught the children of the nobility Greek and philosophy, farmers who tilled huge latifundia, builders who built grand amphitheaters and aqueducts, cooks whose dishes decorated the tables of patricians, cleaners, priests, doctors, poets, and just those who were unlucky enough to be born in the wrong body and in the wrong place, be in debt bondage or be sold out of necessity. To be a slave in Rome meant not to belong to yourself at all. Not in my body, not in my voice, not even in my thoughts. Your physical existence, your abilities, your potential, all this was the property of another person. You could do any job. You could be smarter than your employer. You could have talents that he couldn't even dream of, but you didn't even have the right to protest. The slightest dissatisfaction, the slightest disobedience could lead to terrible consequences for you. You could raise other people's children, take care of them, love them, but you didn't have the right to raise your own. You could live in a huge, luxurious house, but remain forever a shadow in its walls, a disenfranchised object whose existence depended entirely on the whim of the owner. We won't delve into the outright horrors that YouTube, unfortunately, does not welcome and which are too traumatic, but we will show you through the details, subtleties, and everyday minutiae why you, living today in the 21st century, would hardly survive even one day in their position. Because slavery in Rome is not just about whips and shackles, although that was more than enough. It was a comprehensive system where every facet of life, every thought, every movement reminded, you are not a person, you are a resource. You're a thing. Watch this video to the end. We will examine why you would not have had a weekend off, no hope, or even a name if you had lived in that era, and why the very word freedom sounded especially bitter then, like an unattainable dream for millions. Get ready to learn about the price of Roman greatness, which is not written in the history books, but which is forever etched in the destinies of those who did not have the right to their own. In the Roman Empire, a name was not just a combination of sounds for identification. It was the foundation of your identity, reflected your social status, origin, civil rights, belonging to the family, to society. Roman citizens had a complex three-part name: praenomen, personal name; nomen, generic name; and cognomen, nickname or surname indicating a branch of the family. Each part carried a deep meaning and determined the place of a person in the Roman world. But if you're a slave, you don't really have a name. You are the res, the thing. From a legal point of view, you are not a person, but property that is on a par with furniture, clothing, tools, or pets. The historian Moses Finley noted that in ancient times, the status of a slave was determined, first of all, by complete dependence on the owner and the absence of a legal personality. These are not just words. This means that you could not own property even if you earned it. Everything you produced was under the control of your master. You could not enter into legal marriages because this required the status of a citizen or a free person. Your relationship with another slave was called contubernia. It was just a cohabitation that the master could break at any time. You had no heirs in the legal sense, because you could not have the property to inherit and therefore could not make a will. You may have had a nickname given to you by your host, often derisive or related to his image of you. Felix Lucky, although nothing was ever happy in your life. Scorus, nimble. If you were agile, Kikero, chatterbox. If you were eloquent or talkative. Sometimes a slave was called by his place of origin, Cyrus from Syria, or Dacus from Dacia. But this is not a name in the full sense. This is a label that could be changed, erased, or passed to another slave at any time if you were suddenly no longer needed. Real names which gave a person the right to self-determination were the prerogative of the free, and you have only the stigma of fate, which told everyone, you're nobody, you are property. A slave had no right to appear in court on his own behalf, nor could he be a plaintiff or a defendant. He couldn't complain about his master, even if he was treated cruelly by him. Its existence was not considered autonomous. All decisions were made for it. If the owner decided to rent a slave to work for another person, sell them on the slave market, punish them for the slightest offense, or even without it, this did not cause either sympathy from the law or interference from the authorities. In the early period of Roman history, before the 2nd century AD, the murder of a slave by a master was not considered a crime at all, but was considered the destruction of one's property. Only later were some mild restrictions imposed, and then for moral rather than legal reasons. For example, the Emperor Antoninus Pius, the 2nd century AD, issued an edict according to which a cruel master who killed a slave for no reason could be punished. But this was the exception rather than the rule, and only applied in extreme cases. Imagine that your feelings, desires, dreams, fears, and sufferings are simply ignored. Never. You don't belong to yourself, your identity, your I. This is an empty place in the eyes of the law. There is no place for you on the pages of history, no name on the tombstone, except maybe a short inscription indicating your identity. Function only the purpose, only a disenfranchised existence. What does it feel like to be alive, to breathe, to feel, but to be legally equivalent to a chair in the house? This is a constant feeling of invisibility, inferiority, which penetrates into every cell. But if your name doesn't belong to you, then what about your life? This is our next point. Today we are used to the illusion of control over our lives. We choose where to live, who to work with, what to do tomorrow, where to go, and who to communicate with. For a slave in ancient Rome, this illusion would have been completely inaccessible. Your life didn't belong to you, it was a commodity, a chattel that could be bought, sold, leased, exchanged, or even bequeathed. Imagine a morning when you wake up not knowing what to expect. One day you may be working in the kitchen, preparing fine dishes for the masters. The next you may be sent to grueling work in the fields, cultivating the land under the scorching sun. And the day after that, you may simply be sold at the slave market, like cattle, separated from everything that is even slightly dear to you. And this will happen not by your consent, not by your choice, but by someone's whim, at the behest of the owner, who simply decided to update his inventory or needed money. You don't have the concept of home in the modern sense. Your home is the place where the owner will move you. It can be a huge villa in Rome, a secluded estate in Campania, or a gloomy mine somewhere in Spain. They may decide to rent you out to another person to do a specific job, send you to a faraway province to run a farm, or sell you at a slave market in another city, separating you from everyone you knew, from everything that you hold even a little dear. What are your dreams of stability, of permanence? They simply didn't exist. You are a resource and you are moved when it is profitable, when the owner's plans change, or when his financial situation requires it. Your body, your labor, your time, all these are assets that the owner uses at his discretion to maximize his profits or meet his needs. Historical sources are full of examples of how slaves moved around the empire. Educated slave teachers or doctors could be rented out to other families or sent to accompany young Romans on their travels. Agricultural slaves moved from one estate to another, depending on the needs of the crop. The most difficult jobs, such as in the mines or on the galleys, required a constant influx of new slaves, since the mortality rate there was exorbitant. How does it feel to know that every morning can be the beginning of a completely different, unpredictable life that you didn't choose? A life where the only constant is lack of control. A life where your attachment to a place or people means nothing before ownership. This is a constant feeling of uncertainty, the inability to plan anything, to build any long-term plans, and this unpredictability, this constant fear of changes, breaks, the unknown, puts no less pressure on the psyche than physical labor. But if the master is in charge of your life, then what about the lives of those who were born of you? This is our next and perhaps most painful point. This is perhaps one of the most heartbreaking realities of slavery, which strikes right at the heart of human nature. Today we are fighting for the rights of children, for the right of every child to a family, to love, to protection. But for a slave in ancient Rome, all this was not available. If you give birth to a child while being a slave, then from the first breath it is also a slave. This is not discussed, it is an inexorable law based on the principle of partus sequitur ventrum. The fetus follows the womb. That is, the status of the child was determined by the status of the mother. If the mother is a slave, the child is a slave. And none of your feelings, no maternal or paternal love, no attachments mattered. It may grow near you, but this is only a temporary phenomenon. The owner could decide at any time to give it to another family as a gift, sell it in the slave market like you, or even send it to work in distant lands where you will never see it again. It wasn't up to you. Your right to love, nurture, and protect your child was taken away from you the moment it was born. The only thing you could do was pray that he would be lucky to have a master, that he would not suffer the fate of working in the mines or on the galleys, or not be born at all. Imagine this dilemma. You want to have children, you want to continue your line, but every birth is a doom. You don't give birth to free people, but to new slaves, another asset for your master. Their fate is entirely in his hands. Their childhood, their future, their education. All this will be determined by someone else's will. Many slaves, realizing this, may not even want to have children, so as not to doom them to such a fate. But even this decision was not always in their power. The masters could force the slaves to have children, seeing in this a way to increase their capital. Cicero, in one of his letters, mentions slaves born in the house, in Vernae, who were valued especially highly because they were raised in a certain environment and were considered more loyal. The masters even encouraged slave marriages, although they were not legally binding, to encourage the birth rate. This is the price paid by those who couldn't even control their bodies. So he could not dispose of the bodies of his children either. This constant threat of separation, this fear for the future of your children, whom you cannot protect, is one of the deepest traumas that slavery has inflicted. It was not just physical enslavement, but also the enslavement of the soul, the destruction of the most fundamental human bonds. But if you don't have the right to your children, do you have the right to choose what you do every day? Alas, no. Today we choose a profession based on our vocation, build a career, and get an education in order to realize our potential. For a slave in ancient Rome, all these concepts were alien. A slave does not choose a case based on his interests. It is used where it is needed, where the owner sees the maximum benefit. It is a versatile tool that should be ready for any task, whether it is the dirtiest or most refined work. Imagine yourself in the Roman world. Today you may be working in the quarries, where Kyle's every kick is painful in the joints, where dust clogs the lungs, and the danger of landslides hangs over your head. Tomorrow you can be sent to the galleys, where you can row hard while the overseers shout, knowing that at any moment you may be thrown overboard. The day after tomorrow, if you are lucky, you can be sent to the host's house to clean up his excrement from chamber pots, or serve at the table, serving food and wine. Or you can find yourself in an amphitheater, where your bones will break in the arena in gladiatorial fights. The work of the slaves was incredibly varied, but always grueling. Agricultural slaves, servi rustici, formed a huge part of the labor force. They worked on huge estates, latifundia, belonging to the Roman elite, cultivated grain fields, vineyards, and olive groves. Their day started before dawn and ended after sunset. They lived in conditions little better than cattle, in barracks tied to their place of work. The famous agronomist Columella, in his work on agriculture, describes in detail how to feed slaves so that they work efficiently and how to punish them for disobedience. For him, slaves were part of the inventory. Talking tools. Urban slaves, servi urbani, lived in more comfortable conditions, but their duties were no less burdensome. Among them were cooks, bakers, weavers, cleaners, porters, hairdressers, bath attendants, doorkeepers. If the master was rich, he could have hundreds of such slaves, each of which performed its own narrow function. Intellectual slaves brought from Greece or the East could be teachers, doctors, secretaries, readers, artists, musicians. Their labor was less physically demanding, but their lives were still completely subordinate to the master. They were living books or living tools for education and entertainment. Slaves in the mines and mines, servi metallici, had perhaps the most terrible fate. They were literally the living dead, working in dark, damp, stuffy stopes without sufficient food and rest led to a quick death. Seneca, in his letters, describes the horrors of such work, where people died of exhaustion and injuries. Gladiators are a special category of slaves trained for deadly arena fights. Their lives were short and brutal, but they were a symbol of Roman leisure. And finally, slaves in public works. They built roads, aqueducts, amphitheaters, basilicas. Their work was the foundation of Roman infrastructure. And all this, without rest for many hours a day, with a minimum of amenities. No rationed working days, no vacations, no trade unions, no sick days. Only a duty, and the constant fear of punishment for the slightest offense or not working hard enough. This hopelessness weighed on the man much more than you can imagine. For you, there is no concept of motivation other than fear. There is no concept of development other than the ability to execute an order. Do you think it is possible to live when your whole life is reduced to just fulfilling other people's whims? What if you're being watched all the time? The life of a slave was a life under a microscope, and sometimes under the gaze of an overseer with a whip. You were closely monitored. Every step you took, every word you said, every look you gave could be interpreted as a challenge, a refusal to comply, or even an attempt to escape. For the master, the slave was a valuable asset, and its safety and productivity were carefully monitored. The system of supervision was multi-level. The overseers, villaci on agricultural estates, ostiari gatekeepers in houses, were themselves often slaves or freedmen who had gained a certain amount of power, and they were often more violent than the master himself, seeking to curry favor. Their task was to make the slaves work as efficiently as possible and to prevent any signs of disobedience or laziness. Denunciations were encouraged, and slaves often denounced each other in the hope of making their fate easier. Discipline violations could be followed by punishments, and not always physical and obvious atrocities, which again, we will not discuss in detail. Sometimes it was something much more sophisticated and humiliating, designed to break the will and show who was in charge. It could be the deprivation of food and sleep, the simplest but most effective punishment, quickly draining the slave, or public humiliation, exposure to the pillory, shaving the head, branding, although this was more typical for runaway slaves or criminals, but sometimes used. Także disposable handcuffs and chains were also used not only for punishment, but also as a permanent means of control, especially for slaves working in the fields or in dangerous jobs. Roman authors, such as Cato the Elder, recommended that slaves work in chains to prevent escape and increase productivity. As a punishment, they could be sent to more difficult jobs, for example, from a relatively comfortable city house to the mines or to the mines, which was equivalent to a death sentence, or isolate them by putting them in a dark, damp room. Sometimes it was enough just to look the wrong way, to speak at the wrong time, or even to follow an order quickly enough. Punishment could come for the slightest offense, which in the modern world would be nothing more than a minor mistake. Imagine that you don't even have the right to be in a bad mood, to be tired, or to have your own opinion. You must always be agreeable, always smile, always be submissive, even if you are seething with rebellion. The constant fear of punishment, the need to be always on the alert so as not to provoke the anger of the master or overseer, made the slave's life a constant psychological pressure. This led to a broken will, to the loss of one's own I. What does it feel like to not have the right to make mistakes, to be weak, to be human? This is a life where every breath is filled with anxiety, and every look is a potential threat. But if you don't even have the right to your own emotions, do you have the right to rest? The answer will surprise you. Imagine a life where there are no Saturdays, no Sundays, no holidays, no vacations, no holiday breaks, no long weekends, no time off for overtime work. In the modern world, we value our vacation, plan it, and look forward to it. For a slave in ancient Rome, this was a completely foreign concept. The Romans loved holidays. There were many of them. Religious festivals, feriae publicae, state celebrations, games, family feasts. It was a vacation for citizens, a time for fun, entertainment, and participation in public life. But for the slave, this was not rest, but, on the contrary, most often more work. Think about it. If the host is hosting a grand feast on the occasion of a holiday, who will cook for hundreds of guests? Who will serve food and drinks? Who's going to clean up after everyone's gone? Who will carry water for the baths and clean the baths after a full day of ablutions? Who will clean the streets after solemn parades and processions? The answer is obvious: slaves. You were in a rhythm where there is no free time in our understanding. Your rest is just a short, often insufficient sleep needed to recuperate for the next day of hard work. And even while you were sleeping, you might have been summoned to fulfill some whim of the host. Your time is the master's time. You did not belong to yourself even on your birthday, even on the days of the greatest national holidays. Seneca, the Roman philosopher, although he criticized the cruelty of slave owners, still mentions in his letters how slaves should always be ready to work. In some rare cases, slaves could be given one day of rest a year, but this was an exception, a sign of the master's mercy rather than a system right. Even if there was technically less work, the slaves were still kept within the house or estate, under supervision, and could not manage their time. This is a constant feeling of hopelessness, when every day is similar to the previous one, when there is not the slightest hope for a break, for the opportunity to relax, think about something of your own, do something for yourself. This is not just fatigue, it is burnout at the deepest level, complete exhaustion of mental and physical strength. This is a life in which the joy of celebration exists only for others, and for you it means only redoubled efforts. But even if your vacation doesn't belong to you, what about your mood, your emotions? Today, your emotional state mostly depends on yourself, on your decisions, on your success or failure, on how you feel. You have the opportunity to distance yourself from negative people, put aside unpleasant things, and find ways to deal with stress. In slavery, things were different and much, much more complicated. Your emotional and physical state depended on a different person every day, from his whims, from his fatigue, from his health, from his nightly dreams, from the way he was answered on the form, even from the weather, which could spoil his mood. A nice day at the master's, and maybe you'll feel a little better. Perhaps it will be less demanding. You will not be once again punished or reproached for the slightest offense. You may even be thrown some kind word of mercy or leftovers from his table. But this is only a short respite, not a stable position. A bad day for the master. And any small thing, any mistake, any awkward movement can lead to anger, shouting, or worse. He can take out his problems, his anger, his dissatisfaction with life on you, simply because you are the most accessible and disenfranchised being under his hand. Seneca, in his moral letters, condemned the Romans for their cruelty to slaves, for treating them as if they were objects, forgetting that they were also human beings. He wrote, slaves can talk, they can smile, they can cry. Doesn't that mean they have the same soul as you? But such thoughts were the exception rather than the rule. You are a living buffer that absorbs all the negative emotions of its owner. You can't respond, you can't defend yourself, you can't leave. Your survival, your relative well-being, depended on someone else's unpredictable will. This constant tension, which literally exhausted the nerves and soul. You learn to read the mood of the owner by the slightest signs, by his gait, by facial expression, by the tone of voice. You learn to anticipate their desires in order to avoid punishment. You become a master of survival in the face of complete unpredictability. This is living in a state of chronic stress, when you are constantly under threat, when your mental state is completely determined by the mood of the person who owns you. There is nothing more devastating for the psyche than a constant sense of injustice, inability to control your life, and dependence on someone else's whim. But even if your emotions don't belong to you, is there anything that can belong to you? Personal life, perhaps? Alas, and here you will be bitterly disappointed. Today, personal life is sacred. We strive to create a family, to close relationships, to privacy, to the opportunity to love and be loved, to make plans for the future with the chosen person. We have the right to marriage, to a family, to the inviolability of our personal sphere. But for a slave in ancient Rome, the concept of private life was almost an abstraction, if not a cruel mockery. Slaves were rarely allowed to form full-fledged families in our modern understanding of marriage and union. Of course, there could be relations between slaves. They could enter into cohabitation, which was called contuberni. It was a kind of imitation of the family, recognized by the owner, but without any legal force. Such marriages were made with the master's permission, and their main purpose was to give birth to new slaves, which was beneficial to the owner. The host could even encourage such unions by offering some privileges. But this family was as fragile as morning ice. She could be separated at any time, sold one spouse to one family, the other to another, simply at the whim of the owner or because of his financial difficulties. Your children, as we have already said, also did not belong to you, and they could be taken away at any time. Relations between slaves often existed without official recognition and always under threat of separation. You couldn't plan a future with a loved one. You couldn't have a home of your own, even if it was a cabin. You couldn't provide your children with a stable future. Your right to love, to intimacy, to create your own little world, protected from external encroachments, was taken away. The sole purpose of your existence was to serve your master, not your personal happiness. Historian Keith Hopkins noted that slave marriage was more a practical convenience for the master than an expression of human affection. Often the masters themselves chose pairs for their slaves to ensure the birth of strong offspring. Sexual exploitation of female slaves was widespread and was perceived as the natural right of the master. They couldn't refuse, they couldn't complain, they couldn't defend themselves. How does it feel to love someone, knowing that at any moment you can be forever separated? How does it feel to see your children being taken away and not be able to do anything? This constant threat of rupture, this inability to build something solid and reliable, this complete lack of privacy and control over their own bodies and lives. All this made the private life of the slaves unbearable torture. It was not just a life without freedom, it was a life without intimacy, without intimate relationships, without the hope of creating your own corner of happiness. And even if this is taken away from you, is there any hope for a better share? To freedom? When we talk about slavery, we often think about the fact that some slaves could get free labor. It is true that the institution of manumission, liberation, existed in Rome, and at certain periods it was quite widespread. But for the vast majority of slaves, this was an unattainable goal, a veritable mirage, distant and hazy. Yes, some slaves were given freedom for special merits, such as saving the master's life, for outstanding work, for loyalty, or by the master's will after his death. Some slaves who had the opportunity to engage in crafts or trade could accumulate peccoli, a small property that the master allowed them to own, and buy themselves out. In rare cases, the master could simply release the slave out of mercy or for some personal reason. But the statistics are ruthless. Only a small part of the slaves became freedmen. Exact figures are difficult to determine, but historians estimate that these were units of percent of the total number of slaves. Most of them did not live to see this moment or had no chance of getting their freedom. You could spend your whole life dreaming of freedom, seeing it in your wildest dreams, imagining taking your first free breath, but never getting it. The manumission itself did not give us complete freedom in our understanding. The freedman, libertus, became a citizen, but retained certain obligations to his former master, who now became his patron. He was obligated to provide him with services, respect him, and could not oppose him in court. His children were already being born completely free, which was a huge relief. But the freedman himself could never completely erase the stigma of slavery. He always remained a former slave, and this status could be a hindrance to his social advancement. Your life ended where it started, in the shackles of addiction. Even if you were the most talented, the most diligent, the most devoted slave, none of this guaranteed you freedom. Your fate depended on the will and mood of the other person. It's a bitter realization, a hope that will never come true for most, an eternal dream, an eternal longing for something that will always slip away. But even if you were lucky enough to be free, one feeling would stay with you forever. In addition to physical suffering, legal restrictions and deprivation of all rights, slavery put psychological pressure on a person, psychological no less, and sometimes even more. It was a constant trauma that penetrated deep into the soul, leaving an indelible mark. You were not perceived as an equal, as a full-fledged person. Society, from the highest patrician to the poorest plebeian, has looked upon you as an inferior being, as a thing, as an animal. You could have been smarter, more talented, and more educated than many free citizens. For example, slave doctors from Greece were often more qualified than Roman healers, but their status determined everything. Your achievements were not valued as much as those of the freeman. You could build a house, cure a disease, write a poem, but all this was perceived as fulfilling a function, and not as a manifestation of personality. This means that you always felt out of place, even if you were doing the same job as the free ones. You have always been marked different. You were despised simply for being a slave, not for your actions or character. This is a constant feeling of being second-rate, humiliated, that you are not a person, but only a tool. You didn't have the right to vote, you couldn't express your opinion, you couldn't be a part of society in the full sense of the word. You were an object, not a subject. The psychological effects of slavery have taken many forms. It was depression and apathy from constant hopelessness and lack of control over life, leading to deep depression. This is a loss of self-esteem when the sense of insignificance instilled by society destroyed self-esteem. Accumulated latent aggression and hatred. Not being able to express anger openly, slaves could accumulate it internally, which sometimes led to rebellions like the Spartacus Rebellion or covert acts of sabotage. Many slaves learned to be as submissive and adaptable as possible in order to survive, suppressing any expression of individuality in themselves. And finally, paranoia. Constant surveillance, denunciations, fear of punishment formed a deep distrust of others. This feeling, this wound on the soul, remained with them for the rest of their lives. It was not just a physical restriction, but also the slavery of consciousness, when you yourself begin to believe in your inferiority. That was the price of Rome's greatness, built on broken souls. So we've traveled through the daily routine of a Roman slave, and I hope you now understand why it was a fate that would have robbed you of everything. Not just physical comforts or comforts, but the very essence of human existence. You were stripped of your name and identity, becoming property, a thing, without the right to self-determination and legal status. Your will was taken away. Life, work, place of residence. All this was determined by someone else's whim and not by your choice. You were deprived of your family and future because your children did not belong to you, and your relationship was fragile and could be broken at any time. You had no rest and leisure. Every day of your life was devoted to grueling work, without the right to respite, without opportunities for personal development or entertainment. You were deprived of control over your emotions. Your well-being depended on the mood of the owner, and you yourself lived in constant fear of punishment and humiliation. For you, the hope of freedom was a mirage, an unattainable dream that rarely became a reality. And if it did, it left behind an indelible stigma. And the worst thing is that you were deprived of your own I. Psychological pressure, a sense of second-classness, constant contempt on the part of society destroyed the personality from the inside. The Roman Empire, with all its triumphs and achievements, was built on a foundation where millions of people were deprived of all the basic rights on which modern society is built. Our understanding of freedom, dignity, and human rights today is something that the slaves of ancient Rome could not even dream of in their wildest dreams. Every day you spend today, every choice you make, every word you say without fear of punishment, every opportunity to work at will, build your own family and see your children free, this is the freedom that a Roman slave would give anything for. Appreciate it, because their lives were endless proof that a person can only be free when he belongs to himself, when his voice counts, when his dignity is recognized, and when his future is in his own hands. This was the price of Roman greatness. And even if their voices were not heard then, we can hear them now, so that we never forget the price of true freedom.